October 1935. Stephanie St. Clair shut down every runner, every collector, every number slip in Harlem, voluntarily. Her competitors called it weakness. 16 of them moved in. None of them moved back out. October 14, 1935. Harlem woke the way it always woke, in layers. The fruit vendors first, rolling their carts onto Lenox Avenue before 6, arranging oranges and sweet potatoes in the gray pre-dawn light while the last of the night shift workers made their way home along 125th Street. Then the domestic workers, the women in heavy coats heading toward the subway at 135th Street, bound for the kitchens and laundry rooms of white households in the Bronx and Brooklyn and the Upper East Side. Then the children, loud and sudden, filling the sidewalks the way children always fill sidewalks, as if the street had been empty for their benefit and was now, finally, being used correctly. By 7:30 in the morning, Harlem was fully itself. Except for one thing. The runners weren't on their corners. In a neighborhood where the numbers game was as much a part of the daily rhythm as the morning paper or the smell of frying bacon drifting from kitchen windows, the absence of Stephanie St. Clair's runners was not a small thing. It was the kind of absence you felt before you understood it, the way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue before you remember losing it. On the corner of Lenox Avenue and 132nd Street, where a young man named Delroy had stood every weekday morning since 1931, collecting slips and small coins from the same 37 customers in the same order, there was nothing. Just the corner. Just the cold October air. On 135th Street, near the entrance to the Lenox Lounge, another corner was empty. On 139th. On 143rd. On 7th Avenue at 126th Street, where two runners usually worked opposite sides of the block by 9 o'clock, not one appeared. By 8:15 people were noticing. By 9 people were talking. There were 53 runners in Stephanie St. Clair's operation on the morning of October 13, 1935, the Sunday before the silence began. 53 men and women who worked 6 days a week, collecting number slips and small bets from customers across a territory that stretched from 110th Street to the Harlem River, from the western edge of St. Nicholas Avenue to the brownstone blocks of East Harlem. They were paid on time, every time, $3 a day for foot runners, $5 for the senior collectors who managed subroutes. In an era when a factory job, if a black man could get one, paid $8 for a full week's labor, Stephanie's rates were considered generous. Not accidentally. Generously, precisely, deliberately generous, because loyalty, she had learned, was a commodity, and like all commodities, it responded to price. On the morning of October 14th, every one of those 53 runners had received the same message, delivered the previous evening by Stephanie's two senior collectors. The message was brief. It was specific. And it required no clarification. You're on paid leave until further notice. Full pay continues. Stay home. Say nothing. That was the entirety of it. No explanation. No timeline. No reassurance that the operation would resume. Just the instruction, and the envelope of pay already advanced for the coming week, pressed into each runner's hand before 9 o'clock on a Sunday evening. By noon on October 14th, the question was moving through every barbershop and beauty parlor between 110th and 155th Streets. What happened to Queenie's operation? The theories arrived quickly, the way theories always arrive in a neighborhood that runs on information. She'd been arrested. But no, there had been no arrest, no police presence, nothing in the overnight blotter. She'd made a deal, surrendered her territory to the Italians in exchange for protection, the way 2 other Harlem bankers had quietly done that same year. She was sick. She was leaving New York. She had finally decided, after 15 years, that the weight of running an empire alone was heavier than any empire was worth. None of these theories came from anyone who actually knew Stephanie St. Clair. The people who knew her, who had sat across her mahogany desk at 409 Edgecombe Avenue, who had watched her read a police report the way a surgeon reads an x-ray, who had seen her dismantle 2 men's careers in one afternoon with nothing but a telephone and a file of documented evidence. Those people did not speculate. They waited. Because the one thing you learned when you truly knew Stephanie St. Clair was this. When she went quiet, it was never because she had run out of things to say. It was because she had decided that silence, right now, was the most dangerous thing she could deploy. The machine had gone silent. And somewhere in a 4th-floor apartment on Sugar Hill, with 2 ledgers open on a mahogany desk and a fountain pen uncapped and waiting, the woman who built that machine had already begun her next move. Her competitors would not understand this for another 21 days. By then it would be far too late. Martinique. The island sits in the eastern Caribbean like a green fist pushed up through the Atlantic, volcanic, beautiful, and arranged in every human detail, for the comfort of people who did not look like Stephanie St. Clair. She was born into a French colonial world where the architecture was European and the labor was black, where the language of power was taught in schools that accepted certain children and quietly excluded others, where the distance between the colonizers' boulevard and the Black Quarter was not measured in blocks but in the accumulated weight of generations of enforced silence. Her mother worked with her hands. Her father was, by most accounts, absent in the specific way that colonial economies made men absent, pulled toward whatever work existed, wherever it existed, with nothing left over for permanence. What Martinique gave Stephanie St. Clair was not comfort. It was not privilege. It was not the kind of childhood that gets romanticized in later years. What it gave her was observation. She watched how the French administrators moved through the market, the particular angle of entitlement in a man's shoulders when he believes the world was organized for his benefit. She watched how the merchants calculated, how the police decided who to stop and who to pass, how information moved through a community that had learned, across 2 centuries of colonial rule, that official channels were not built for them and that survival required building channels of your own. She was learning systems before she had a word for what she was learning. By the time she was 26 years old, she had seen enough. The word traveled the way all important information traveled in Harlem. Not through newspapers. Not through official channels. Through the barbershops. By the afternoon of October 15, 1935, 36 hours after Stephanie St. Clair's runners had failed to appear on their corners for the second consecutive morning, the information had moved from the barbershop on 132nd Street to the numbers banker in the basement of a building on 138th Street to a telephone call placed from a payphone on 7th Avenue to an office in the South Bronx where a man named Vincent Rouse sat behind a desk and listened without speaking for approximately 90 seconds before hanging up the phone and reaching for his coat. The message was simple. Queenie's operation is dark. Has been for 2 days. Nobody knows why. Vincent Rouse was 38 years old, connected to the Lucchese crime family through a network of policy banks that stretched from Arthur Avenue in the Bronx down through East Harlem and into the fringes of Stephanie's territory on the eastern edge of Lenox Avenue. He had been watching Harlem's numbers operation for 3 years with the focused patience of a man who understood that the territory was worth more than anything he currently controlled, and who had been waiting, with professional discipline, for exactly this kind of opening. He put on his coat. He made 2 phone calls. He was in a car heading south toward Harlem within the hour. He was not the only one moving. In a rooming house on 118th Street, a Harlem-based numbers banker named Cecil Moore heard the same information from a different source at approximately the same time. Cecil Moore was 41 years old, broad-shouldered, and had been operating a small but functional policy bank out of a dry goods store on the eastern edge of Stephanie's territory for 4 years, carefully, deliberately, always staying just inside the boundary of what her operation would tolerate. He had always known where the line was. He had always stayed behind it. Until October 15, 1935. When the line disappeared. Moore made no phone calls. He walked 4 blocks to the dry goods store, went into the back room, and spent 2 hours with a map of Stephanie's runner routes. A map he had been quietly assembling for 18 months, the way a man assembles something he hopes never to need but cannot bring himself to stop building. He began marking the corners he intended to claim by the end of the week. There were others. 2 men operating out of Washington Heights, former associates of Dutch Schultz's Harlem apparatus who had survived the Dutchman's 1935 assassination by being peripheral enough to escape the subsequent reorganization, saw the news as confirmation of something they had been arguing for months. That Harlem's numbers territory, with Schultz gone and his Italian successors still consolidating power, was in a period of genuine structural vulnerability. That the right move, made quickly and decisively, could establish a foothold that would be difficult to dislodge. They were correct about the structural vulnerability. They were catastrophically wrong about almost everything else. A Bronx-based policy banker named Samuel Greer moved 3 of his runners into the 139th Street corridor by October 17, offering Stephanie's former customers a slightly better payout rate, $650 to 1 instead of the standard $600, as an introductory incentive. A numbers operation connected to a Brooklyn syndicate began making quiet inquiries about collection point availability in East Harlem. 2 independent street-level bankers, men who had been running small informal operations in the margins of Stephanie's territory for years, always careful never to grow large enough to attract her attention, suddenly and simultaneously decided that the margins had widened considerably. In the space of 72 hours, 16 separate individuals or organizations had moved, or were actively planning to move, into the territory that Stephanie St. Clair had built over 15 years. 16. Not one of them had asked her permission. Not one of them had considered why that might matter. This was the assumption that connected all 16 of them, the shared error that would define what happened next. They assumed the territory was the operation. The corners. The collection points. The runner routes. The customer relationships. The daily float. The payout schedule. In their understanding, shaped by every other numbers operation they had ever seen change hands, through death or arrest or intimidation or simple financial collapse, the territory was the thing. Claim the corners, approach the runners, keep the customers paying their pennies, and the operation was yours. It was a reasonable assumption. It was completely wrong. What Stephanie St. Clair had built in Harlem over 15 years was not, at its foundation, a territory. It was a relationship. Hundreds of them. Thousands of them. Built one Friday envelope at a time, one lawyer's retainer at a time, one family protected from eviction at a time. The runners who worked her corners were not simply employees who would transfer their labor to whoever showed up next with a better daily rate. They were people whose rent Stephanie had covered in bad months, whose brothers she had kept out of jail, whose mothers she had sent to doctors when the city's hospitals turned them away. Cecil Moore's runners arrived on the 132nd Street corner on the morning of October 17th with a competitive offer and confident smiles. The regular customers looked at them, kept walking, went home, did not place a bet that day. Moore's men waited 2 hours in the October cold before reporting back that the corner was, for reasons they could not explain, generating zero business despite a visible customer base moving through the block at normal volume. It was the same story on 139th Street. The same on 7th Avenue. Samuel Greer's runners, offering their introductory $6.50 to 1 payout, stood on corners where Stephanie's customers passed them every morning like they were lamp posts. Not hostile. Not confrontational. Simply not there. Vincent Rao held a meeting on the evening of October 18th in the back room of a restaurant on 116th Street. 4 men around a table. A map. A problem that none of them could articulate precisely, but all of them were beginning to feel. The customers aren't buying, one of his men said. We've been on 6 corners for 3 days. We're doing maybe 15% of what those corners should produce. Rao was quiet for a moment. Are they going somewhere else? He asked. Other bankers? His man shook his head. Far as we can tell, they're just not playing. Waiting for something. Rao looked at the map. At the pins marking Stephanie's former collection points, now theoretically his. At the routes his runners had been walking for 4 days with almost nothing to show for it. Waiting for what? He said. Nobody at the table had an answer. Across Harlem, in a 4th-floor apartment on Edgecombe Avenue where the desk lamp burned past midnight and 2 ledgers lay open side by side, Stephanie St. Clair was writing down their names. She already knew the answer to Vincent Rao's question. They were waiting for her. The shutdown had been planned for 6 weeks before it happened. Not improvised. Not reactive. Not the desperate move of a woman cornered by forces larger than herself. 6 weeks of deliberate, methodical preparation. The kind that left no visible seam, no traceable edge, no moment where an outside observer could point and say, there. That is where it began. That was the point. Stephanie St. Clair had learned, over 23 years of navigating systems built to exclude her, that the most dangerous moves were the ones that looked like nothing at all. It had started with a conversation in late August 1935. Not a dramatic conversation. Not a meeting called with ceremony or urgency. Just Stephanie seated at her mahogany desk on the 4th floor of 409 Edgecombe Avenue on a Tuesday evening, reviewing the intelligence ledger, the second ledger, the one that tracked everything the operational ledger didn't, and noticing a pattern that had been assembling itself quietly across the previous 4 months. The Lucchese family's policy banks in the Bronx had been expanding southward. Not aggressively, not yet, but steadily, in the incremental, patient way that well-organized criminal enterprises expand when they believe they have time on their side. 3 new collection points had appeared on the northern edge of East Harlem since May. 2 of Stephanie's easternmost runners had been approached, discreetly, professionally, with competitive salary offers, by men she didn't recognize but whose affiliations she had identified within 48 hours through her precinct contacts. Cecil Moore had extended his dry goods store operation 2 blocks west in June, crossing a boundary he had always previously respected. And in Washington Heights, the 2 Schultz holdovers, men named Carver and Briggs, whom Stephanie had been tracking since the Dutchman's assassination, had been seen in meetings with a Harlem-based fence whose business overlapped with 3 of her collection routes. None of these movements were individually decisive. Each one could be explained as coincidence, opportunism, the ordinary friction of competing operations in a crowded territory. Together they formed a map. And the map told her that within 6 to 9 months, if current trajectories continued, she would be managing simultaneous pressure from 4 directions: Italian expansion from the north and east, Moore from the south, Carver and Briggs from the west, while also managing the ongoing attention of Thomas Dewey's office downtown, which had been building its Harlem investigation with the quiet patience of a man who believed he had already won. She could fight each pressure individually. She had done it before. Or she could do something none of them would anticipate. She could disappear. Bumpy Johnson came to Edgecombe Avenue on a Thursday evening in early September. He was 29 years old that autumn, broad-shouldered and unhurried, with a particular quality of stillness that made rooms recalibrate when he entered them. He had been working for Stephanie since 1932, not as muscle though he was capable of it, but as presence, as visibility, as the man who moved through Harlem's streets and social spaces with enough authority that his proximity to Stephanie's operation communicated, without a word being spoken, that certain decisions would carry consequences. He sat across the desk from her in the usual chair and listened without interruption while she explained what she intended to do. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. 3 weeks, he said. 21 days, Stephanie confirmed. And while we're dark? She placed the intelligence ledger on the desk between them and opened it to the page she had been building since August. 12 entries. Names, dates, movement patterns, organizational affiliations. The beginning of a map. While we're dark, she said, I need to know everyone who moves. Every corner they claim. Every runner they approach. Every collection point they establish. Every dollar they take from customers who should be ours. Every contact they use inside the precincts. She paused. I need names, Bumpy. All of them. Every person who decides that my silence is their opportunity. Bumpy looked at the page. Then he looked at her. You're setting a trap, he said. Stephanie said nothing. She closed the ledger. That was confirmation enough. The infrastructure of the shutdown took 3 weeks to arrange. Every runner had to be briefed individually, not in groups where information cross-contaminated, but one at a time by one of Stephanie's 2 most trusted senior collectors. The message had to be precise enough to ensure compliance and vague enough to ensure that if any runner was subsequently approached by competitors or investigators and asked what they knew, the honest answer was, not much. The finances had to be structured to sustain the pause. 53 runners on full pay for 3 weeks, plus the senior collectors, plus the ongoing retainer for the lawyer on 145th Street, plus the operational reserve that Stephanie maintained at all times against exactly these kinds of contingencies, the kind of contingency that looked like disaster from outside but had been planned for from within. She had been building that reserve since 1928. The shutdown would cost approximately $4,200 in direct payroll and overhead across 21 days. She had 40 times that in reserve. The customers had to be managed without being managed, which meant that nothing could be said to them directly because anything said directly could be repeated. Instead, Stephanie relied on something more durable than instruction. She relied on the 15 years of relationship she had built with every regular player on every corner in her territory. The understanding, communicated through nothing more than the absence of her runners and the silence that followed, that Queenie's operation had paused. Not ended. Paused. The distinction mattered. Anne Harlem, which had learned to read Stephanie St. Clair's silences with the same attentiveness it read her actions, understood it without being told. By October 17th, 3 days into the shutdown, Bumpy's intelligence reports were arriving daily. He didn't write them down. Writing created evidence. He arrived at Edgecombe Avenue each evening between 6 and 7 o'clock, hat in hand, and delivered them verbally while Stephanie sat at the mahogany desk and transcribed what he said into the intelligence ledger in her narrow, precise cursive. The ledger became a living document, filling nightly with the kind of information that no prosecutor's wiretap could have assembled, because it came not from surveillance equipment but from a neighborhood that had eyes everywhere and had decided whose side it was on. October 17th. Vincent Rouse runners established on 6 corners. 3 in East Harlem, 2 on the Lenox Avenue corridor, 1 on 139th Street. Organizational affiliation confirmed. Lucchese-connected Policy Bank operating out of a restaurant on 116th Street. Names of 4 runners identified. October 18th. Cecil Moore expanded from 4 collection points to 9, absorbing 3 of Stephanie's southernmost corners. 2 of Stephanie's former runners had accepted Moore's employment offer. Their names. Their new routes. Their new daily rates, which Moore was paying from a float that, Bumpy reported, was considerably thinner than he was representing to the runners he was recruiting. October 19th, Carver and Briggs, the Schultz holdovers, had established a collection point on the western edge of 143rd Street and were using a Harlem-based intermediary, a man named Roland Price who ran a shoe repair shop as a front, to process their numbers. Price's address. His relationship to both men. The name of the precinct officer who had been seen entering the shoe shop twice in the preceding week. The ledger filled. 23 entries by the end of the first week. 41 by the end of the second. By the morning of October 31st, day 18 of the shutdown, the intelligence ledger contained the most comprehensive map of Harlem's competing numbers operations that had ever existed in one place. Names, routes, organizational affiliations, financial structures, precinct connections, vulnerabilities. It was not a list of enemies. It was a set of instructions. On the evening of November 1st, Stephanie made 3 phone calls. The first was to Arthur Garfield, the civil rights attorney on 145th Street. She did not explain the full scope of what she was building. She gave him 2 names, a precinct officer and a city licensing official, and 3 specific dates, and asked him to begin preparing the documentation for a formal complaint. He asked no questions. That was why she used him. The second call was to a contact at the Amsterdam News, not the editor, not yet, but a reporter she had worked with before, a man named Howard Webb who understood the difference between a story given to him and a story he had assembled himself, and who was smart enough to know which kind lasted longer and which kind mattered more. She gave him one name. Cecil Moore. She told him that Moore's operation had a specific irregularity in its payout structure that made it, technically, exploitative of the customers it was currently serving. Customers who happened to be the same people the Amsterdam News wrote about and for every week. She told him to look at it. He said he would look at it. The third call was the shortest. She called a woman named Iris, a seamstress who worked out of a building on 138th Street and who was, without any official title or acknowledged role, the closest thing Harlem had to a central node of community information. Iris knew everyone. Everyone trusted Iris. And Iris, who had received Friday envelopes from Stephanie's runners for 11 consecutive years, understood without being told that when Stephanie called, the conversation was not casual. "I need people to know," Stephanie said, "that the corners will be back in 3 days." Iris understood what this meant. She also understood what it did not mean, that those 3 days were not for the competitors to prepare. They were for Harlem to be ready. "I'll make sure," Iris said. Stephanie thanked her and set down the phone. She looked at the intelligence ledger. 47 entries now. 16 individuals or organizations. A complete map of every person who had moved into her territory, every resource they had committed, every contact they had exposed, every vulnerability they had revealed by the simple act of believing that her silence was permanent. She uncapped her fountain pen. She began writing the final column of entries, the column she had left blank across 21 days of surveillance, the column marked simply in her precise cursive at the top of the page. Response. 3 days. Then she was coming back. November 4th, 1935. Monday morning. 6:47 a.m. On the corner of Lenox Avenue and 132nd Street, a young man named Delroy arrived 12 minutes before his usual time. He wore his regular coat, his regular cap, and carried nothing unusual, just the small leather satchel he had carried on this corner every weekday morning since 1931. He took his position at the northeast edge of the intersection, the way he always took it, with his back to the building wall and a clear sight line in 3 directions. He did not announce himself. He did not need to. By 7 o'clock, he had taken his first 11 bets of the morning from customers who had, for the past 3 weeks, walked past this corner without stopping. They did not ask where he had been. He did not explain. The transaction was the same as it had always been: a slip of paper, a small coin or folded bill, a nod. The ordinary ritual of a neighborhood economy resuming its rhythm after a pause. Across Harlem, on 52 other corners and collection points, the same scene was playing out simultaneously. The machine had come back on. Vincent Rowe's man on 135th Street noticed it at 7:20. He was standing at a corner he had been working for 18 days, in weather that had grown progressively colder and with results that had never exceeded 20% of what his operation had projected. He had been there since 6:30 that morning, early, trying to capture the domestic workers' commute, the way Stephanie's runners had always captured it. He had taken 4 bets in 50 minutes. Then he watched a man he didn't recognize take up a position half a block south, and within 8 minutes, 11 customers who had walked past him without stopping had detoured around the corner to reach that man instead. He called Rao at 7:35. "She's back," he said. Rao was quiet for 4 seconds. "All of them?" he asked. His man looked down Lenox Avenue, where 2 more of Stephanie's runners had appeared at their corners in the time it had taken to make the call. "All of them," he said. By 9 o'clock that Monday morning, the competitive landscape of Harlem's numbers territory had shifted with a speed and completeness that none of the 16 operators who had moved in over the previous 3 weeks had believed was possible. It was not that Stephanie's runners were aggressive. They were not. There were no confrontations, no territorial disputes, no men blocking other men's corners with the kind of physical assertion that tends to escalate in predictable and expensive directions. Stephanie's runners simply returned to their positions and resumed their work, and the customers, who had been waiting with the patience of people who understood that some things were worth waiting for, returned with them. Cecil Moore's 9 collection points generated a combined total of 11 bets on the morning of November 4th. The previous Monday before Stephanie's return, those same 9 points had generated 143. Samuel Greer's runners, who had been offering their introductory 650 to 1 payout for 2.5 weeks, packed up their positions before noon and did not return. The introductory offer had cost Greer more than it had earned him. The customers it was designed to attract had never arrived in the numbers that his projections required. By the afternoon of November 4th, 12 of the 16 competing operations that had established themselves in Stephanie's territory over the previous 3 weeks had effectively ceased to function. Not through violence, not through confrontation, but through the simple and devastating reality that the customers they needed had already decided they weren't interested. The machine had come back on. And it had come back on at full power, because the community that ran through it had never transferred its loyalty to anyone else. It had simply waited. But Stephanie St. Clair had not spent 21 days building an intelligence ledger in order to simply reclaim her corners. The corners were already hers. They had never stopped being hers. The men who believed they had claimed them had been operating a fiction. A 3-week performance of ownership in a territory that the community had never actually surrendered. What the 21 days had given her was something more durable than a resumed operation. It had given her documentation. On the evening of November 5th, the day after the return, Arthur Garfield filed a formal complaint with the city licensing office against 2 of the precinct officers whose names Stephanie had identified in the intelligence ledger. The complaint cited specific dates, specific locations, and specific financial transactions. Officer Marcus Webb of the 28th Precinct documented accepting payments from Vincent Rao's operation on October 19th, October 24th, and October 29th, at addresses that the complaint named precisely. Officer Daniel Corrigan of the 32nd Precinct documented in 2 meetings with Roland Price, the sure repair front for Carver and Briggs, on dates that coincided directly with the absence of any police interference in those operations. The complaint was not a criminal filing. It was a licensing matter, dry, administrative, the kind of document that moved through city bureaucracy without headlines and without drama. Arthur Garfield had chosen this avenue deliberately at Stephanie's instruction, because a licensing complaint required a response. It created a paper trail. And a paper trail, once started, had a way of developing momentum that no one involved in its creation could fully control. Both officers requested transfers within 11 days of the filing. Neither request explained the reason. Howard Webb's piece in the Amsterdam News ran on November 9th. It was not a front-page story. Stephanie had not asked for a front-page story. Front pages attracted the kind of attention that required responses, denials, legal maneuverings, the full defensive apparatus of men who had been publicly named and needed to be seen fighting back. What she had asked Howard Webb for was something quieter and more precise. A factual, documented, below-the-fold piece about the payout irregularities in a specific Harlem numbers operation that had been exploiting customers over the previous 3 weeks. Cecil Moore's operation. The piece was 412 words. It cited no anonymous sources. Every figure it contained came from documented transactions that Webb had assembled by interviewing 17 of Moore's former customers, all of whom had switched their bets back to Stephanie's runners the moment they reappeared on November 4th and were therefore no longer in any position to protect Moore's operation through silence. The piece named Moore's dry goods storefront directly. It named the specific payout discrepancy. Moore had been paying $580 to 1, not $600, a differential he had introduced quietly in his second week of operation and which his customers had not discovered until they compared notes. 20 cents on the dollar. In a community where a dollar represented real sacrifice, 20 cents was not an abstraction. It was rent money. It was food money. It was the difference between a week that worked and a week that didn't. The Amsterdam news piece ran on a Saturday. By Monday morning, Cecil Moore's dry goods store had 3 city health inspectors on its premises, responding to a complaint about its food storage practices that had been filed, anonymously, on the preceding Thursday. The inspectors found enough to issue a temporary closure notice. Moore's operation did not reopen. Carver and Briggs were the last to understand what was happening to them, which was appropriate because they had been the least careful. The documentation Stephanie had assembled on their operation through Bumpy surveillance included not just their current Harlem activities but their residual connections to the Schultz apparatus, connections that, in the post-Schultz reorganization of New York's organized crime landscape, made them simultaneously exposed to the Italian family's consolidating power and to the federal investigators still processing the aftermath of Schultz's murder. Stephanie did not file a complaint about Carver and Briggs. She made one phone call. The recipient of that call was a federal court clerk whose name does not appear in any public record connected to this story, and whose relationship to Stephanie St. Clair was one of approximately 40 such relationships she had cultivated over 15 years with precisely this kind of moment in mind. She gave the clerk 2 names. She cited 3 case numbers from the ongoing Schultz federal proceedings. She noted that certain documentary evidence, if examined in the context of those proceedings, would be of interest to the prosecutors involved. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. Carver left New York before the end of November. Briggs followed 2 weeks later. Neither returned. By December 1, 1935, 47 days after the shutdown began, every competing operation that had moved into Stephanie St. Clair's territory during the 3-week silence had been removed. Not one act of physical violence had been required. Not one direct confrontation. Not one threat delivered face-to-face. 16 operations. 16 removals. Administrative complaints. A newspaper piece. A phone call. The patient, methodical application of documented evidence against people who had operated for 3 weeks under the assumption that they were dealing with an absence rather than a strategy. They had walked into a territory they believed was abandoned. They had walked into a map. And the woman who had drawn that map sat at her mahogany desk on the 4th floor of 409 Edgecombe Avenue on the evening of December 1st, closed the intelligence ledger for the final time, and placed it in the bottom drawer of the desk. She did not celebrate. She opened the operational ledger. There was work to do. There was always work to do. December passed quietly. The corners were full. The runners were back on their routes. The customers had returned, not just the regulars but new faces, people who had heard the story of the 3-week silence and its aftermath the way Harlem heard all its important stories, through the barbershops and the beauty parlors and the church pews and the kitchen tables where the real history of a neighborhood gets written and preserved. The number slips moved through Stephanie's operation the way they always moved, steadily, reliably, with the quiet efficiency of a system that had been built to last. From the outside nothing had changed. From the inside, everything had. Stephanie made 2 modifications to her operation in the weeks following the shutdown. The first was structural. Beginning in January 1936, she formalized what had previously been an informal intelligence gathering practice into a permanent, ongoing function of her operation. Bumpy Johnson's role, which had always included an intelligence component alongside his more visible responsibilities, was explicitly reoriented toward surveillance and information management. 2 additional contacts were cultivated inside the 28th and 32nd precincts, replacing the officers who had transferred out following Arthur Garfield's licensing complaint. A 3rd newspaper contact was added alongside Howard Webb at the Amsterdam News, a reporter at the New York Age whose beat included City Hall and the lower Manhattan court system, and whose access to information about Dewey's ongoing investigations would prove, in the years that followed, to be among the most valuable relationships Stephanie maintained. The intelligence ledger was no longer a reactive document, assembled in response to a specific threat. It became a living record, updated weekly, tracking the movements of every competing operation, every relevant official, every shift in the organizational landscape of New York's numbers world with the same methodical precision she had always brought to her operational ledger. Information had always been her primary weapon. Now it was her permanent infrastructure. The second modification was quieter, and in its way more significant. In the weeks after her return, Stephanie increased the Friday envelopes. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would be noticed as a policy change by anyone outside the operation. But the amounts went up, by 10% across the board for families on the regular list, and with 3 new families added to that list, each of them connected in some way to the runners or customers who had held the line during the 3-week silence. who had walked past Vincent Rouse's men and Cecil Moore's men every morning without stopping, who had waited. She did not explain the increase. She did not attach a note or a message or any acknowledgement of what it represented. The envelopes arrived the way they always arrived, quietly from a runner who knocked once and left without waiting for thanks. But Harlem understood. In a community where loyalty was not an abstraction but a daily, material practice, something you either demonstrated or you didn't, something that either showed up in your life when you needed it or revealed itself, in its absence, as the performance it had always been, the increase in the Friday envelope said everything that needed to be said. You held. I remember. This is what that means. There were consequences for the ones who hadn't held. The two runners who had accepted Cecil Moore's employment offer during the shutdown, their names were in the intelligence ledger, precisely recorded alongside the dates they had crossed over and the daily rates Moore had paid them, were not confronted. Were not threatened. Were not subjected to any of the direct retribution that men in Stephanie's position routinely applied to the disloyal. They were simply not reemployed. When Stephanie's operation resumed on November 4th and the full runner network returned to their corners, those two men were not among them. No explanation was offered. No message was sent. Their positions were filled by two others from the waiting list that Stephanie's senior collectors maintained for exactly this purpose. The men understood. Harlem understood. The message was delivered in the cleanest possible language, not anger, not punishment, but the simple and permanent withdrawal of an opportunity that had been earned over years and surrendered in 3 weeks. Power exercised through restraint is the most durable kind. It requires no defense. It generates no sympathy for its targets. It simply closes a door quietly and moves on. By the spring of 1936, the story of the 3-week shutdown had taken on the particular quality that certain Harlem stories acquired when they were true enough and remarkable enough to survive retelling without losing their essential shape. It moved through the community the way all durable stories move, not as rumor, which distorts, but as something closer to legend, which clarifies. The details shifted slightly in the telling. The number of competing operations varied depending on who was speaking. Sometimes 12, sometimes 20, the precise figure less important than the magnitude it represented. The specifics of how each competitor had been removed were not always accurate. The broad truth, however, the truth that mattered, the truth that the story was designed to carry, remained intact in every version. Queenie had gone quiet for 3 weeks. Every man who thought her silence was weakness had revealed himself. And then she had come back and removed them all without firing a single shot. This was what the silence had been worth. Not just the tactical victory, the corners reclaimed, the competitors dispersed, the precinct officers transferred, Cecil Moore's operation shuttered by a health inspector on a Thursday morning. Those outcomes were real and they mattered. But they were not the deepest return on the investment Stephanie had made across 21 days of deliberate absence. The deepest return was what the shutdown proved. It proved that the community was real. That 15 years of Friday envelopes and lawyers' retainers and church donations and genuine, unglamorous investment in the daily survival of a neighborhood had built something that could not be bought away, threatened away, or simply walked into and claimed by whoever arrived with a competitive rate and an assumption of weakness. It proved that information, assembled with patience and precision, was more decisive than force applied quickly. That the map she had built during the silence was worth more than any weapon she could have deployed instead. And it proved, to every competitor, every corrupt official, every prosecutor building a case in a downtown office, every man who looked at a Caribbean immigrant woman running Harlem's most significant economic operation and decided that the right move was to underestimate her, that Stephanie St. Clair's power was not incidental to who she was. It was the product of who she had always been. A girl from Martinique who had watched colonial power operate from the outside, who had crossed an ocean alone at 26 with $200 and a capacity for observation that no institution had given her and none could take away. Who had built an empire not from violence but from intelligence, not from fear but from genuine investment in the people around her. Who had learned, in a city that spent 30 years trying to break her, that the most unbreakable thing in any room was a prepared mind that had already thought further ahead than anyone else in it. She had gone silent for 21 days. Every man who moved had shown her exactly who he was. And then she had come back. She always came back.